Thank you and good evening. Good evening to Q&A live from the Octagon Theatre in Perth. I'm Tony Jones, answering your questions tonight. The Chief Executive of the Minerals Council of Australia, Mitch Hooke. The Minister for Defence, Stephen Smith. West Australian broadcaster and Indigenous mentor, Narelda Jacobs. WA Green Senator, Scott Ludlam. And the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, Julie Bishop. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Q&A is simulcast on ABC News 24 and News Radio, and you can join the Twitter conversation using the hashtag that just appeared on your screen. Our first question tonight comes from Romeo Di Girolamo, I beg your pardon. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Fair effort. For the average West Australian, the boom is over. For business, extreme staff shortages, higher wages, backward federal awards, along with extreme lease and expense increases, have left business struggling. Add to this unaffordable rental and house prices, increasing cost of living pressures, and people struggling to cope. I asked the panel, where is the legacy, and what should the legacy of a once-in-a-century boom be?
Scott Ludlam, let's start with you.
Brilliant. How great to be asked that on primetime TV. I think the legacy should be in a mix of things. It should have been an infrastructure that we started getting in a long time ago, including public transport. It should have been an investment in affordable housing. It should have been an investment in the kind of economy that comes after the boom. We are promoting large-scale renewable energy installations around the country. If you're going to be building for what comes after the mining boom that you know is finite, you should be building for the kind of infrastructure in society that you want to be there when the holes in the ground have all been dug. I think it's still possible to do it, but we've left it till pretty late.
Mitch Hooke.
It's a great question. I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question that it's over. I'm more inclined to Premier Barnett's views that it's not a boom, it's actually the new normal. This is going to go on for some time on the demand side, but as you rightly point out, it's the loss of competitiveness on the supply side that is now the major challenge for Australia. The emerging economies that are resource-rich are catching up fast. So don't worry about the demand for our products. That's pretty well locked in. It won't materially shift from its axis until 2025. But on the supply side, we need to be far more competitive. We've doubled our costs, we've lost a lot in productivity, and we've got a deteriorating sovereign risk reputation. That is what we need to turn around if we're going to actually continue to have enduring value from what is the greatest global secular structural change in a generation.
Just briefly, how well was the boom managed? I think that goes to the heart of the question. There's a whole list of boom-related issues and problems.
Well, we got caught napping when China took off and India took off, and we've been struggling to remedy the supply capacity constraints. But the price-led growth is over. It's now a question of moving to volume and costs and productivity. Companies really went out of their way to try and gear up to meet the demands offshore. But I agree with Senator Ludlam that a lot more could have been done in terms of investing in infrastructure. Wow. That's the physical side, but also the social side. There's a lot more we could do in investing in the capability and capacity of our people. That's probably one of the greatest legacies we could leave this boom. The other point I'd make is don't think that the benefits of this boom haven't been washing through. The last time we had a boom in the 70s, many people here are too young to remember, but we ended up with double-digit inflation, interest rates and unemployment because we were a rigid, locked up, tight, inflexible economy. Fast forward 30 years on, and most of the benefits of the boom are washing through. The authorities have it that we've done about 40% better, about $400 a week per family better, as the highest terms of trade in 150 years have washed right through the economy. So there has been a benefit to Australia as a whole. And withstanding the global financial crisis, that you can put that down to 3 decades of reform and having a unique mix of resources amongst the OECD countries with our export profile.
Narelda Jacobs, you heard the question, a whole series of identified problems with the boom. Do you think Western Australia got value for money from the boom as it was?
Well, as Senator Ludlam has said, easing the cost of living pressures. In WA, we have seen mass redundancies across the resource sector. In fact, all other sectors as well. We've seen it in the media and down the supply chain of resources. And with that, people are losing their jobs, they're losing their livelihoods. The cost of utilities has gone up from July 1st. The cost of power, gas, water, public transport, car licensing has all risen on July 1st for this financial year. Housing, Senator Ludlam said, affordable housing, the cost of rent is astronomical in WA, on par almost with Sydney. So the cost of living has not changed, and yet this mining, it has slowed. As you've said, Mitch, it might be back to normal, but people have lost their jobs and livelihoods, and tens of thousands of Gen Ys, indigenous workers have having to find more employment. So it's pretty dire for a lot of people. People are struggling here in WA.
Stephen Smith, has it been well managed?
Well, I think the two things that, as a state and as a nation, we've really missed over this period has been sufficient investment in infrastructure and sufficient investment in skills and training. They're the two long-term legacies that I think we needed to and continue to need to do more on. And there are elements of that in Scott's contribution and also in Mitch's. But let's not forget that as a country, we've now seen more than 20 years of continuous economic growth, and in Western Australia, that's been higher. So some of the problems drawn attention to in the question are actually the problems of prosperity. Yeah. That goes to cost of affordable housing, it goes to cost of living. So yes, there are people in the minerals and resources sector who have lost their jobs because we're moving from the investment and construction phase into the production cycle. And so there are adjustments that are difficult for people who've lost their jobs, obviously, and there's also cost of living pressure. But we are a much more prosperous society now in Perth and in Australia than we were 20 years ago. We are about the only country in the world who had more than 20 years continuous economic growth. We sheltered ourselves from the global financial crisis, and we have economic statistics and indicators now which are the envy of the world. What are our short-term problems? Our short-term problems are making sure we don't see a high rise in unemployment, making sure that we continue to see low inflation and low interest rates, and we've got to take cost of pressure on families who are struggling to make ends meet.
Julie Bishop, well, I'll bring you back in, Scott, but I want to hear from Julie Bishop first. And I mean, do we have trouble managing prosperity in this country?
Australia's economic model is an open, export-oriented one, and our standard of living depends upon our ability to trade our goods and services with other countries. The mining and resource sector has enabled us to raise our standard of living because they have been selling commodities to countries who have an insatiable demand for them. But we're not the only country on earth that has iron ore, coal, gold, copper and the like. So we have to make sure that we can continue to sell our commodities, our minerals and resources overseas, and that we're internationally competitive. That's why the Coalition opposes the mining tax, because other countries don't pay a tax at that level. That's why we've been concerned about the carbon tax, and the government has now at last agreed that the carbon tax is impacting on cost of living. And
I tell you what, we will come to those issues.
Yeah,
If we could just get you to address the actual question, which is really about managing the boom, how well that's been done in Western Australia.
And so what we're looking for in this country is the capacity to still sell our goods and services overseas. And I believe that we need to broaden and deepen and diversify our markets elsewhere for our manufacturers, for our small businesses, for people seeking to export other than in the minerals and resources sector. As far as the management of the mining and resources sector here is concerned, the demand from China helped us get through the global financial crisis. Of course, there were decades of reform. The government inherited no debt from the previous government, and that helped so that it was able to continue to support Australians through a global financial crisis that really hurt other countries. So I think we need to be pragmatic about it. Of course, we've got to invest in infrastructure and skills and education and training. The mining and resource sector has provided a lot of opportunities for many, many people, including Indigenous people, young people, and I don't want to see the mining boom end. I want us to continue to have sustainable growth in this state and this country, which makes us one of the best places on earth to live.
Scott Ludlam, you want to get in briefly?
Well, a bit, because I'm not sure that really went to the question at all. If things are so prosperous at the moment, why is homelessness going up? You know, if you're a new start at the moment, once you've taken out the exorbitant cost of rentals in this town and elsewhere, you've got $17 a day to live on. Now, if this is as good as it gets, and the answer, Julie Bishop's just given us the answer to faltering mining sector is more mining, I really do worry that there's not going to be anything when things go south, when the party stops. We've kind of put ourselves in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party.
I actually talked about broadening and diversifying our economy beyond mining and resources. I talked about the need to find new markets. The globe is our marketplace. We should be finding new markets for our manufacturers, our small businesses and the like. So I didn't say that was the only answer, so don't verbal me. What I was actually saying is that we do need to broaden and deepen and diversify our exports, our markets, as well as maintain a sustainable mining and resource sector.
Mining has helped wipe out those sectors that you're naming, partly by the high dollar and the fact that we've overheated the economy. And you live here, you know that.
That's not right.
No, that's not right.
Okay, Mitch, jump in briefly, because we've got another question.
Well, that's not right.
You did agree with me before, Mitch.
Mining is, directly mining's running at about 8% of GDP. When you throw in all of the indirect and related activities, the Reserve Bank has it as about 18%. That means the services economy is, still about 2/3 of this country's economy. We're employing about a bit over 1 million people in the mining sector, according to the Reserve Bank. So the point being is that this idea that there's, a sort of two-speed economy is actually not right. It was right back in the 70s when we were a rigid, inflexible economy, and the economy overheated because of the heat generated in a part of it, i.e. mining and agriculture back then. But now it's washing through. The Reserve Bank and others have it that about 2/3 of the increase in national revenue from the highest terms of trade in 150 years is washing through the economy. The other third, about 98% of that is profits going to the mining companies, and that's being reinvested back into, of that other third.
Mitch, I'm going to get you to wind up because Stephen Smith wants to get in and we've got another question to go to.
I'll just finish. I confused people in that last one. Of the other third, 2/3 of that third, about 98% of that is being reinvested or paid as taxes back into the country. So it is washing through.
I think the great change that we've seen as an economy and as a nation since the 1970s has been we're a great trading nation. It used to be the case that when the United Kingdom went into the common market, we went into apoplexy. When the United States economy used to have a sneeze, we'd get a cold. We're much more diverse than that now. So in the case of Western Australia, where it remains the case that 70% of our state's economy is minerals and petroleum resources, it's not just an export to Japan as it once was, it's China, it's Korea, growing into India and the like. And our export markets are not just North Asia, it's Indonesia, it's Southeast Asia, India and Africa are growing off very low basis. So properly managed, in the end, the thing that is most important to people's livelihood is economic growth and the chance for a job. You provide those two things, then all of the difficulties of economic pressure, people on low incomes, you can manage or ameliorate those. You can't do anything with negative economic growth and unemployment.
Okay, well, taxation of the mining industry has been a huge question, especially during the boom. We have a question on that subject. It's from Ryan Hudgie.
Mitch, don't you think that Ken Henry's proposed mining tax would have been far more effective for Australians?
No. No, I don't. It was fundamentally flawed in its theory. Without getting, I'm not an economist, but without getting into a whole stack of economic stuff, basically Ken was suggesting that because mining is supposedly immobile, i.e. it's in the ground, it can't move, that you could tax it and you wouldn't change behaviour. Well, the missing link in all of that was people, investment, technology, expertise is highly mobile. And as Julie was just saying before, in a globalised industry, companies will strategically deploy their capital to where's the best opportunity to do it.
Can I just make the point, Ken Henry's version of the mining tax was a 40% tax on after-tax profits for companies, all mining companies in fact, earning more than $50 million profit. Now, he reckoned that was going to raise up to $24 billion. Did you sort of pop champagne in the office when you ended up with one that raised virtually nothing?
Well, yeah. Well, why don't I try dealing with one leading question at a time? I'm not as smart as you. So the point is that, as Tony just said, the effective tax rate would have been 58 cents in the dollar over what you earned above the long-term bond rate. So what you'd get by putting your money in the bank, you get hit at 58 cents in the dollar. Bear in mind the company tax is 30 cents. So it was putting us at the Mount Everest of tax rates. Now, when we shifted to the other tax, and as you say, it hasn't collected a lot of revenue, the 24 billion or whatever figure they put on it was actually assuming business as usual. It assumed that those mines would continue.
I thought you were saying we are having business as usual in the mining.
No, that was missing. Sorry, mate, I'm obviously not doing too well here. What I was trying to say was that this boom, usually when people talk about booms, it's up and down with a bust. Right? This one's going to go on. We've gone past a super cycle. We're into a mega cycle. This is going to continue. You're not going to see China and India or any of those countries, and it's not just them, Latin America, South Africa, or the African nations, they're not going to exit the zone of high commodity intensity for at least another 15, 20 years.
Okay, so on the question of taxation, I'll bring in Stephen Smith. Is it time for Kevin Rudd to reconsider, since he's got a big hole in the budget now, he's bringing an emissions trading scheme in, reconsider going back to Ken Henry's version of the mining tax?
Well, we're not proposing to change the current arrangements. There's no point gilding the lily. It was a very difficult exercise for us. When the first so-called super profits tax was announced in a budget, that met a very strong reaction against it by the minerals and resources industry in Western Australia and Australia generally. So we changed policy. You say a tax that doesn't collect much revenue. In the short term, that's right. In part, it's because of Mitch's point, which is the same circumstances don't exist now as they did when the tax was introduced. But the important feature of the minerals resources tax is exactly the same feature as the petroleum resources rent tax, which we introduced back in the 70s and the 80s, which is it's a tax on profits, and as profit returns to not just large
well,
mining
it's, I mean, in
companies,
fact, it's unlike Ken Henry's model, it's a tax on profits on certain minerals, on just a few companies, and on a very different basis than he suggested.
It's a tax. Well, Blind Freddie could tell you that it was a different tax from what Ken recommended in his review. It's a tax on iron ore. It's a tax on coal. It's on the model of the petroleum resources rent tax, and the tax doesn't apply unless you make a profit of 75 million. Now, that's a much better tax model than a royalty tax or a ad valorem royalty rate, which is on production, not on profit.
Okay,
and over the long term.
The main point being, I think you said at the beginning, that you're not looking, or the new government won't be looking, the new Kevin Rudd government, I should say, won't be looking at changing the arrangements.
No, because...
Okay, all right, that's all we need to know.
Final point very quickly, Tony.
Yeah, okay.
People made the same comment about the petroleum resources tax back in the 70s and the 80s. Since it was introduced, it's now raised, I'm happy to be corrected, it's raised anywhere between $26 and $28 billion. So likewise, the minerals resources tax in time will do the same thing, an elegant tax on profit, not a tax on production.
Julia Bishop, an elegant tax.
What Stephen
one that doesn't earn money when you're not earning a lot of it.
There's a new definition of Commonwealth revenue from a tax that doesn't raise any Commonwealth revenue. What Stephen has avoided is the way these taxes were brought in and the impact that it had on Australia's reputation as a reliable place to invest. The issue of sovereign risk was raised for the first time in living memory in relation to the super profits tax. It came about because of a lack of consultation. This has been a hallmark of the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd governments, a lack of consultation. There was a lack of understanding of how the design of the tax would impact on our reputation. Then they dumped the tax and came up with another tax that doesn't raise the revenue that the budget says it will. And you don't have to go far outside this country to have people tell you that it is a sovereign risk to invest in Australia in the mining and resource sector. I was at a conference the other day.
Is it a sovereign risk because there's a tax that doesn't earn any money, as you just said?
No, because they keep chopping and changing. because they keep chopping and changing, and business wants certainty. Mining and resource companies plan decades in advance, and if the government keeps chopping and changing the tax every time they get the design wrong because they've failed to consult with people, then it's bad for our reputation. I have been in Africa, in Indonesia, throughout Asia, and there is so much capital from Australia and from companies that used to invest in Australia now investing elsewhere, and the reason they're doing it is they say the sovereign risk, because you can't get a straight answer from the government as to what the tax regime is going to be 1 week to the next.
Okay, we've got quite a few questions to get through. Keep our answers short.
I will. It wasn't a tax on reputation. It was a tax on gargantuan profits that the industry was making. And I think the Treasury model was right. If I was wearing a hat, I would take it off, because Mitch, as an industry lobbyist, did an extraordinary job in that after knocking a Prime Minister over for a $22 million ad campaign, brilliantly crafted, saved themselves, avoided paying tens of billions of dollars in tax from projects that would have gone ahead anyway, by writing their own tax code.
And
you wrote your own tax law.
That? Who let them do that?
Remarkable. Hold on, let me get to that. Because
that's
when
the
you...
crux of the question.
No, the crux of the question is that Rio Tinto...
Who designed the tax? Not Treasury?
Rio Tinto made
Not the government?
$9 billion, no, Mitch wrote it, made $9 billion last year and paid no minerals royalties taxes.
So the government's
at
lost
all.
control of its taxing regime.
We got put into a position of either voting with you folk for nothing at all, just have it the industry's way, or voting for a tax that looked to us as though it had been written by the industry it was designed to tax. It raised something. We think it should be amended so that it actually works as it was intended.
You want to admit to writing it?
I've got to respond to that, can I?
Yes.
You did start out with agreeing me. I thought we just need to clear that up.
Okay, seriously, quick response.
Number one, we're in the business of policy, not politics. I'll leave others to make judgments.
You made the ads.
What was the... Yeah, and they were good
They were
ads.
quite political ads, Mitch.
They were good
They were
ads that
reasonably
were
political
about
ads.
the integrity of what was being proposed. I mean, very simply, what Ken Henry put on the table was a super profits tax as a proxy for an economic rent tax. In other words, the rent on the value of the mineral in the ground. And the original proposal was to reform the state royalties, to move them to a profits-based royalty. Never happened. So what we've now got is a state royalty, a company tax, and a new top-up tax. It wasn't about tax reform. It was a tax grab. Now, you got to say, well, hang on. When the boom started, we were doing about $4 or $5 billion in tax and royalties. Last year, we did $20 billion. How much more do you want out of a cow if you keep milking it and it goes barren?
Tony,
Yep.
it's one thing to... It's one thing for Julie to complain about a tax which, on her assertion at the time and now, raised too much money, and then a change tax which she says raises no money. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. But the real serious point I want to make is this:
on the government's part.
is that to assert that this is somehow a sovereign risk issue is a nonsense, and to assert that it's adversely impacted upon investment in Australia is also nonsense. Investment in Australia is currently the largest share of our GDP in history. We have record investment in Australia, so to blindly assert that there's a sovereign risk here is a nonsense. Governments have changed legislation as it relates to the minerals and resources industry forever and a day, whether it's environmental legislation, whether it's native title, whatever it is. It's nothing to do with sovereign risk. The investment in Australia is stronger now than it's ever been in our
Okay,
history.
our questioner's had his hand up. Let's just come back to... thank you. Let's come back to you, Ryan, and we'll try and wrap it up with your comment.
Just want to ask a quick question. You don't consult on low-income earners when you're going to tax them, so why consult big mining companies when you're going to tax them?
Okay. Thank you.
Is that a comment or a question?
I'm going to take that as a comment. Let's move along to a very different tax. Next question comes from Beth Hewitt.
Hi, I work in a small commercial refrigeration company which has been heavily impacted by the carbon tax. Refrigerant gas prices have increased 500% since the introduction of the carbon tax, and our customer base is largely small family businesses who can't afford for us to move that price increase on. My question is, now that the government has decided to move from the carbon tax, axe the tax, and move to an ETS, is it admitting that the whole formation of that tax was incorrect and they underestimated its impact on businesses?
Thank you very much. Brief answers, and we'll start with Stephen Smith.
Well, the government's original legislation, rejected twice by a combination of Julie and Scott in the Senate, was for an emissions trading system. That was what we wanted. When we couldn't get that in a hung parliament, we got a tax or a price on carbon. Policy rationale for that is that there's too much carbon in our economy and in our environment, and we have to reduce that, and we have to make our contribution to that. So we set a price. That was the legislation that we could get through. The Greens, on 2 consecutive occasions, refused to allow an emissions trading system to go through. We've now decided to bring forward the emissions trading part of our current legislation and regime to 1st of July next year, and that will see a reduction in the price which was set to a floating price.
To take up the questioner's point, seems to be an admission you got it wrong in the first place.
Well, we wanted to put in an emissions trading system in the first place, and Scott and Julie and their political parties opposed it and stopped us.
OK, but you're saying you got it wrong in the first
No,
place.
not at all.
If you have to change it
Didn't
now,
have the guts to take it.
you can't blame other parties for your tax.
Well, I'm making a factual point. I'm making the factual point. We wanted to introduce an emissions trading system because the market would then set the price of carbon.
But I'm making the point it's not compulsory to set a 3-year tax. You chose to do that.
We chose to introduce legislation to take carbon out of our economy and our environment, because not only is that in our national interest, it's in the international interest. All of the science, all of the evidence is there, and we have to make our national and individual contribution to that. Our legislation, which imposed a price on carbon, always had the movement to an emissions trading system by the 1st of July in 2015. We're bringing that forward for a year,
all right.
and that's as a result of a whole range of changes in our economic circumstances.
OK, before we come to the rest of the panel, and I know the politicians I mean, I'd like to hear from Narelda, get a perspective from someone who's not a politician or a lobbyist for the mining industry.
It's certainly good timing to cut the carbon tax, and I think it's definitely a vote winner for the Labor government. But I think voters probably will be a little bit suspicious because of the budget shortfall that it will create. What else are we going to have to pay for in the future to meet this shortfall? Will we not be paying the carbon tax in its current form, but will there be further costs down the track that we just don't know about yet?
Julie Bishop.
Well, first, this is an admission by the government that what the coalition's been saying all along was in fact true, that a carbon tax would impact on cost of living and would impact on investment, because they are the 2 issues that Chris Bowen, the Treasurer, mentioned today, the cost of living and the drag on investment. But it doesn't matter what Labor calls it, it's still going to go up year on year, because Labor's own forecasts still have the price on carbon, the carbon tax, increasing into the future to a lot higher level than it is now. So if those forecasts aren't to be believed, then there's a massive hole in the budget, and Labor must state what will be cut in order to pay for a reduced carbon price. If the carbon price does remain the same, well, then it is a tax that will go up to ultimately $350 a tonne on the government's own modelling. So I think that this is a political con, and if Labor was serious about getting rid of the carbon tax, they would recall Parliament and put it in legislation, because this will be the second Prime Minister that goes to an election saying there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead.
OK. Just before I bring it, I just would like to go back to Beth Hewitt, our question. You talked about refrigeration. The cost of refrigeration has gone up hugely. The ACCC, I think, is investigating this because they say it shouldn't have gone up anywhere near as much as it should under the carbon tax. Are you watching that investigation? Because the idea is you may have been subject to price gouging.
Well, we as a company will wait and see what happens, but we get letters from our suppliers that say as of next week it'll go up, as of next month it'll go up. And on the 1st of July last year, we got a letter from our major suppliers, the major supplier within Australia, saying that the price of gas would go up. R404A, which is the one that you use in most commercial refrigeration things, 406% in one day. You can't pass that on to your customers.
I've got to ask you, when you hear that there's a shift to an emissions trading scheme, does that make you feel any differently about this?
No, because it's a floating system and it can float down, but it can also float up. And how are we going to prepare when it's bouncing up and down and we can't budget and prepare for projects that we might be doing 3 years down the track, knowing what price we're going to be paying?
Okay, Scott Ludlam.
I think it is a really useful question. When, when the wholesale price of electricity goes up 10% and somebody comes along the next day and slugs you for an input cost that's 400% higher, I would be with Tony on that. I would be paying very close attention to what the ACCC is doing. But can I just ground this question very quickly as to why we didn't vote for the first one is because it wouldn't have worked. Your carbon price would have been about €1 a tonne at the moment. That was why we didn't vote for it. What Kevin Rudd's just done for short-term tactical advantage, which I agree with Narelda probably will be quite popular, is sacrificed and cost us another year. This is about the weather itself turning against us. Can we please, just for a moment, ground the conversation about why we pass these kinds of laws, why we are trying to prevent the worst and most dangerous impacts of climate change, is because they will wreck the economy. They will wreck the economy, not just here, but all of our supplier and customer countries, within our lifespans. This is not something for our kids to deal with. This is on top of us now. That is why we're trying to come to grips with this situation. I would like to quickly acknowledge and shout out the kids at Power Shift in Melbourne who have been conferencing on this stuff all day and over the last couple of days to try and do a better job than the old parties have been doing, quite frankly. Having Tony Abbott marching around the landscape today saying, oh, it's some kind of invisible gas, we're just wasting our time. Really, grow up, grow up.
All right, we'll come back to that. Since you raised the issue, we've actually got a question from Trent Howard. It's to you.
G'day, Scott. I was just wondering, with most economists saying that supporting a floating price point ETS is the way to go to cut carbon emissions, will the Greens support that if it comes down to the Parliament?
About bringing the price forward a year, or bringing the floating system forward a year?
Bringing the float
We'd have
forward.
to see what kind of bill they brought forward. I find it extremely ironic that Kevin Rudd's come back with the mood of change and the first thing he's done is attacked asylum seekers and action on climate change. It's like this is all very familiar to us. We'll support it if it works. My great fear is that all it does is cost us a year and $4 billion. Are they going to take that out of the Biodiversity Fund? Are they going to take it out of renewable energy? They're going to take it out of businesses like yours who could apply for money to be more energy efficient.
So what you're saying is you'll support it if the cuts come from some other part of the budget, not in the climate area, is that what you're saying?
The cuts shouldn't be happening at all. It's a terrible idea. So you'd always wait and see what kind of legislation came forward, but we are not in a mood to support anything that delays serious and significant action on climate change by another 12 months.
So let's just say Kevin Rudd brings the Parliament back and brings new legislation to bring the ETS forward by a year.
Yeah.
Not just an election promise, but he tries to legislate it before the election. What do you do?
The scenario, I think, is actually quite unlikely. I think they should just call the election. Here is one area
That's
where
what
I'm
you
going to
think
agree.
they should do. What if they did? What if they decided to stay around till, let's say, October, bring the Parliament back and try and institute some of these changes he's talking about?
I think we would be very unlikely to support it. Our party room hasn't met. I think we would be very unlikely to support something that cost us $4 billion and another 12 months delay.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a con.
Stephen Smith, you want to respond to that? I'll bring Mitch into the announcement.
Just a range of issues. I mean, there's one issue in general terms that Scott and I agree on, which is we have to do something as a nation to make our contribution to dangerous climate change. So we have to start reducing the amount of carbon in the economy and in the atmosphere. Tony, not Tony Jones, but Tony Abbott today says it's an invisible gas. Yes, that's the problem. It's invisible. It's called carbon dioxide and it's causing dangerous climate change. But a couple of very quick points. Our questioner who has got the refrigeration business is clearly been subject to misrepresentations about the effect of carbon pricing on her industry, and yes, the ACCC will be taking a very close interest in that, just as we have shown repeatedly in the Parliament about people's assertions about increases in electricity prices and what is the cause of that. And yes, we say some of that is our legislation, but not the vast bulk of it. We want to have an emissions trading system because that will take carbon out of our economy and our environment.
Okay,
and we'll do it in a way.
The question everyone wants to know, are you prepared to put this to Parliament before the election?
Well, we'll do it. Well, I don't know when the election is going to be, so I can't tell you whether Parliament will sit. But we'll do it in a way in which the market sets the price, firstly. Secondly, we've made it clear through the Treasurer today that as revenue falls as a result of the bring forward of the emissions trading system, we will make the necessary adjustments to the budget. I don't think it's any secret that that announcement will be a matter of sort of hours and days away, not days and weeks. So people, including Scott, will be able to see how we have responsibly approached this to bring forward the emissions trading scheme, but also to make sure that loss of revenue is dealt with in a responsible way.
Okay, Julie Bishop, I've got this invisible substance that Tony Abbott is talking about, CO2. Do you think he's trying to imply by this that it's a harmless substance?
No, what he's implying is that emissions trading schemes have not been successful anywhere in the world. The European Union's emissions trading scheme has been racked by corruption and bad behaviour and bad management. The emissions trading scheme has not been successful anywhere. And since the Copenhagen conference at the end of 2009 is quite... I'm sorry?
Should we just stick with the tax then?
No, we're saying we repeal the carbon tax.
Because that has been quite successful.
No, we want to repeal the carbon tax. You can believe Tony
Will you
Abbott
repeal
when he
the
says
emissions
to repeal
trading
the
scheme
carbon
as
tax.
well?
We don't believe that the government is going to move to an emissions trading scheme, and our point has always been that we should act in coordination with the rest of the world. We are about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That's what Australia is responsible for. If we don't wait for the United States and China and other countries, we will ruin our economy while nothing changes in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions. So we believe that there are actions that you can take, direct action, the same sort of thing that President Obama was talking about in the United States.
Against the invisible substance?
That will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Well, Tony, it is not visible to the naked eye, so he's making an evident point. But the point is...
That's still a bit silly.
The point is, he was talking about the fact that emissions trading schemes have not been a success anywhere in the world. And if other countries don't act, then we should focus on what we
our
can
questioner's got his hand up, but what we're
what
really
we
talking...
can control, and that is our direct action plan.
Okay, all right. What we're really talking about is the choice of words, and my question to you was, is this a wolf whistle to climate sceptics to say it's an invisible substance?
No, he was talking...
A dog whistle.
Well, you could always ask Tony Abbott what he meant. My understanding from my discussions with Tony is that he was talking about the failure of emissions trading schemes and the fact that Kevin Rudd is making a fraudulent statement when he says that he's getting rid of the carbon tax, tricking people into believing that somehow they're going to reduce the cost of living because they'll take the tax off electricity, when in actual fact their own modelling shows that their tax on carbon, their price on carbon, whatever you want to call it, will keep going up and up and up.
Okay,
the whole point of putting a price on carbon is to change behaviour.
I'm not meaning to interrupt your flow. Our questioner had his hand up again. We'll quickly go back to you.
Just quickly a comment that even though you raised, Julie, that it was only 1% of global emissions, also we're the highest per capita in the world of emissions. So I think that's important.
Okay. Now, Mitch, I do want to bring you in, but I'd like to hear, I mean, most of the business community seems to support an emissions trading scheme. Does the mining industry?
Only if it's globally aligned. I mean,
only if it's what, sorry?
Globally aligned.
Right.
I mean...
That is the plan,
The point, well, not really. At the moment, bringing the price down is only one part of the equation. You've also got to go to the architecture of what the European scheme... It's about the only one that's actually working out there. It's only covering about 7% of world's global emissions. But there's been a bit of ducking and weaving going on here. You're quite right, ma'am. The carbon tax was introduced to hurt. It is introduced to actually try and change behaviour. Now, we have this ridiculous circumstance where we get a tax on one hand, and we bring it around, we give a revenue churn to compensate people for the very behaviour that you're trying to change. Doesn't make sense. If you're going to cause pain here in Australia, you want to make sure that it's not so much pain that it puts us at a competitive disadvantage with the rest of the world. This is a global challenge, and it is a global solution. Your question, sir, about per capita is really not the measure, with great respect. It is actually... No, it's not. I mean, you may want to have that as a moral argument, that's fine, but it is actually about... It is actually about your carbon emissions per GDP, your carbon productivity. And if we're going to have carbon competitiveness in a carbon-constrained world, then that argument is absolutely spot on.
Okay.
We need to go down that path, but you've got to have a global protocol. You've got to have a real price that's aligned with what's going on in the rest of the world, and you must focus on technologies, because if you don't have the technologies to change your behaviour, it just goes to the bottom line, as you said, ma'am.
Stephen Smith, a very quick response.
Of course, when we introduced carbon pricing, we had adjustments to help industry and we had adjustments to allow households to make ends meet. Just as we did in the 1980s with all of our major economic reforms, when we made big economic reforms like bringing down tariffs to make Australia a much more attractive part of the international community, we gave people compensation for that. We made adjustments. So the notion somehow that Mitch wants to say this was a policy to punish and we shouldn't have given compensation, A, is wrong. B, we wanted to make sure that households and industry were able to make the adjustments. But in the end, as a nation, we have to reduce the amount of carbon in our atmosphere and in our economy, and that's the international contribution we have to make. And it's not true to say that there aren't other emissions trading schemes in the world, California, China and the like.
Okay, all right, let's move along. Sorry, we can't spend all night on one issue. Our next question comes from Padmini Saxena.
Some of my brightest and most exemplary students are Aboriginal. It breaks my heart to see some of them fall by the wayside, caught up in the cycle of drugs, alcohol, and violence. They have so much potential in them and can achieve whatever they set their hearts out to. What Nick Natanui and Narelda Jacobs have just observed is what a lot of us in the community feel. What can we do to improve the situation of these kids? And I want both sides of the political spectrum to answer this one.
I'd like to start with Narelda on that.
Yeah. Thank you. Let me just start by saying that there are fantastic things that happen in the Aboriginal community all over Australia. WA is no exception. There are very strong Aboriginal women who do so much to hold their communities together. I have visited several times girls in juvenile detention, and I too am very upset when I see that, you know, the juvenile detention centres aren't built for Aboriginal children, and yet you can count on probably one hand the number of white children in juvenile detention centres. Most of them are Aboriginal children, and it is very disheartening to see that. The more I've been going there, the more I learned that some of these girls reoffend because it's actually safer inside juvenile detention. It's safer behind bars in their room at these juvenile detention centres than it is in their own home, in the community, in their own home. Some of the girls have learnt to read and write behind bars. These are girls who are aged 14, 15, 16, very low literacy and numeracy levels. The Department of Child Protection workers are on the front line. This is a really difficult issue to go into someone's home and to try and teach them to be better parents. There's some really frightening stories, horrific stories that have come out that I've heard about, and a friend of mine was telling me a story about a 2-year-old girl who was sexually abused so badly she can not have children as an adult. And these stories are absolutely shocking. They are shocking, and we need to be shocked because we need to know that this is going on in the cities, in the towns, in the country that we live in, because we need to do something about it. We need to stand up and say this is not how we want the next generation of people growing up to not know how to be good parents. There are amazing people in our community who do amazing things, but the need is immense.
Let me just, the question, thank you. So the questioner raised Nick Natanui, and you don't often get big-time footy stars buying into issues like this. First of all, for the rest of the country, tell us what he actually said, what his observation was, and how important that was.
Yeah, he lives in the eastern suburbs, and he was observing paint sniffers, petrol sniffers, I guess, hanging around at train stations, and he tweeted about it, and it got a lot of discussion, which is fantastic, because we can't bury our heads in the sand and pretend that these things don't happen, or just walk past people who do these things, because it's affecting people's lives. You know, as you did say, everybody is born, you know, with the same opportunities in life, and we know that behind all these stories is somebody who has so much to give Australia as a person, and we as a community need to do everything we can to make sure those opportunities are available to them to take the opportunities into their homes. You know, some of the parents of the girls that I was talking about, they are familiar with the phone number of the school or the government department. They simply don't answer the phone. You know, so it's about, I think, providing role models to show these kids, if you can do it, then I can do it. And Nick Natanui has, you know, he's really done a great thing by highlighting these issues as well.
Okay, the questioner asked to hear what politicians say or intending to do about these issues. Stephen Smith, you first.
Well, these are long-standing intractable problems which our nation and our state and individuals like Narelda have tried to address for a long period of time, and we have to keep on doing it. If you look at, Narelda's given us some individual instances. If you look at all of the statistics, high rates of imprisonment, high rates of recidivism, low educational outcomes, appalling life expectancy and health outcomes, and we just have to keep at it. This is an area where we've got to set our strategies as we have in the last 15 years or so, and just try to make the focus on employment, on skills and training, on education and on health outcomes. But this continues to be a blight on our nation, a blight on our society, and we have to keep on working at it.
Narelda, just before I cross to the other side of the table here, when you're calling for action here, you know what happened to the Northern Territory. The intervention was designed, in fact, to address a lot of the issues that you're talking about. Do you think there should be something like that happen in Western Australia?
Oh, the women in the communities need help, and the elders, not just the women, all the elders in the community need some help. I don't know if it's a matter of the army going in, but I'm
open to that.
But certainly services.
Okay, Julie Bishop.
Tony Abbott has promised that if he becomes the Prime Minister of Australia, he will take Indigenous affairs into the Prime Minister's office so that the Prime Minister of the country is responsible for the Commonwealth laws and programs and initiatives relating to Indigenous Australians. That the issue is so significant and so serious that it needs the attention of the Prime Minister as part of the Prime Minister's core responsibilities. And I think that that will be a good start in ensuring that it receives the attention and that the highest elected person in the land takes responsibility for our laws and our programs and our initiatives that support Aboriginal people. Narelda and I were at a function on Friday evening for NAIDOC Week, and there were a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who were paid tribute to. Their lives were celebrated because they're such extraordinary role models. And Jonathan Thurston and a whole raft of people and former greats like Neville Bonner were all celebrated. And I think that that's what we need, more examples of young Aboriginal people working with others, like the Clontarf schools here in Western Australia, where young Aboriginal people are connected to education through sport. They love their sport, they're good at sport, and it's the hook to get them into education. When I was the Federal Minister for Education, one of my concerns in Aboriginal education was actually getting the kids to school, getting the children to attend school, and then having the parents make the connection between the children having an education, attending school, getting an education, and then getting a job. They have to see that connection of attending school, getting an education, getting a job, and then they can have some economic independence. That's so important.
I'm sorry to make you brief, but we've got a few questions to get through.
It's good practice. Thanks to the questioner and thanks to Narelda for framing the discussion. We've both heard really measured contributions, both from Julie and Stephen, and if only that was the case during election campaigns, where we see political parties getting into law and order auction, tough on crime, tough on kids, lock them up, stay safe, kind of really degraded political debate. What we should instead be looking at are exactly the kind of things that have been said here in a much more measured way, but it's not what we often get. We get things... We get things like the intervention, where they sent the army into the Northern Territory and totally disempowered people who are now campaigning against it being rolled out elsewhere. Look for justice reinvestment. Look for transferring money out of the criminal justice system and into precisely the kind of services that people are talking about. And it's hard to have that conversation if the election debate's really degraded. So maybe we can continue this discussion over the coming months.
Can I just pick up on this? Very quickly, back to one of the first questions about the benefits of the boom flowing through the economy. This is actually one of the great stories. When I came in the mining industry nearly a decade ago, we'd just come off the back of the Mabo debate. It was divisive, it was confrontationist, but increasingly people of my generation started to realise the utterly miserable circumstances that Indigenous people were living in, that we had come from a generation that practised systemic racial discrimination and didn't even really know it and understand it. Fast forward now to where we are. We've got over 500 land use agreements on foot, not one of which contests native title. We've moved into future acts. We've moved into actually making it happen. We are now the largest Indigenous employer in Australia. We used to be just the private sector, but we're now the largest Indigenous employer. We've actually provided opportunities. You said empowerment, that's what it's all about.
Okay.
And some of that training is actually quite expensive because you've got to have mentors and you've got to understand culture, and it's not about assimilation, it's about integration. It's about mutual respect, it's about understanding their special connections to land and waters, understanding their interests and being able to cater for that in economic normative behaviour that we have in society today.
Right,
that's a real plus.
Okay, thank you. Got to move on. Our next question is from Alex Hamilton.
Julie Bishop, you've stated that your party would adopt a policy of towing the boats back to Indonesia when it was safe to do so. Considering last month, the Indonesian ambassador said that no such collaboration will happen between Indonesia and Australia, how do you expect to achieve this?
First, our policy is not to tow boats back to Indonesia because that would be a breach of Indonesia's sovereignty, so that's not our policy. And today, in the media, Foreign Minister Marty Natalegawa confirmed that the coalition has been in discussions with Indonesia about all of our policies, including turning boats back around in Australian waters or international waters. He confirmed that the Indonesian government is open to discussion with the coalition about our policies. And he's confirmed essentially what we've been saying all along, that the Indonesian government is aware of our policies. They were aware of them 10 years ago when John Howard first introduced them. And he's confirmed that they are open for discussion with us. And we've said there'll be a no surprises policy approach with Indonesia, that we will continue to talk to Indonesia. We cannot, as an opposition, enter into a formal agreement or a treaty or sign negotiations with a foreign government. But should we be elected, I am confident that we will be able to put in place the policies that stop the people smuggling trade, stop the boats, and prevented the hundreds and hundreds of deaths at sea that are currently occurring under the government's current policies.
Do you still claim, incidentally, that Indonesian officials say one thing in public and another thing behind closed doors?
I didn't say that in the context of this debate. You'll find that I gave that statement to the Guardian newspaper online about public diplomacy and private diplomacy generally. I was talking about the nuances behind diplomatic language. The comments I made later had nothing to do with the comments I made earlier. It was a separate interview, but they were put into one interview, but they were two separate interviews. So I was talking about diplomatic language generally, where you read the signs, you read the nuances. But in relation to Indonesia, separately, I am confident that given the discussions we've already had, as confirmed by Foreign Minister Natalegawa today, I am confident that we will be able to implement our policies. And we will not take action that would come as a surprise to Indonesia, nor will we take action that is outside the Bali process, which the Howard government put in place to ensure that countries in our region are cooperating in ensuring we can stop the boats.
Thank you. Stephen Smith, Kevin Rudd said after the last deaths over the weekend, asylum seekers being drowned, that the situation with Indonesia is now urgent. It's been urgent for a long time, presumably, but he's saying it's now urgent. So would you consider, if it's that urgent, if the Indonesians are going to allow the coalition policy, that is, towing back the boats up to pretty much Indonesian waters and pointing them in the direction of Indonesia, would you consider doing the same thing?
Well, Foreign Minister Natalegawa said no such thing, Tony. I mean, as I understood his comments today, he said he was open to a discussion with the coalition to find out what their policy was.
Have you read the transcript,
So
Steve?
let's not have Julie over-egg it nor you over-egg it. What do we know?
Well, he
about,
said,
what do we
in
know?
fact, he said that the statement that was issued by the President in the presence of Kevin Rudd in Jakarta does not preclude each nation taking action within its jurisdiction, which presumably agrees with what Julie Bishop was saying.
It's
if
not.
you do it in Australian waters and you take the boats up to Indonesian waters, point them in the direction of Indonesia and push them off, that's apparently okay.
It can't be taken to mean what you asserted to mean, nor what Julie asserts it to mean. But let's just go back to the notion of towing back the boats.
So what do you think he means?
Well, what I think he means is that the coalition has made it clear that irrespective of Indonesia's view, and there's more than one Indonesian official from the highest authority down have made it clear this is not a policy approach that they would welcome, nor would they cooperate with. I think that's what he's saying. But let's just go right back to basics. The assertion here is that somehow...
Do they actually have to cooperate with it?
Well, let's just go back to basics, Tony. The assertion here is that somehow, in a world where we've got between 45 and 50 million people moving around trying to find a place of refuge, that somehow saying to a patrol boat captain, tow the boat back, is somehow going to be successful. Firstly, we know that in the Howard era there are a small number of boats that were towed back. We also know that one of the people who was involved in those operations, the current Chief of Navy, who said that it was a very dangerous exercise, that the people smugglers had learnt since the small number of boats were towed back to disable the boats, to put people at risk, including not just asylum seekers but also Navy personnel. So a notion that somehow putting asylum seekers and putting Navy personnel at risk on the high seas is a sensible policy approach is just something we would not contemplate. And the Chief of Navy has made that absolutely crystal clear.
Stephen,
in his
1,000
evidence
people
at
have
Senate
died at
estimates.
sea.
Absolutely.
What are you going to do about it? What laws are you going to change? What decisions are you going to make as the Minister for Defence?
Well, if we had introduced... If we'd been able to introduce the so-called Malaysian solution, we believe that would have broken the cycle. We are now dealing with a worldwide and international problem,
would have been exhausted within 3 days. 800 people. We're getting thousands arriving.
I'm happy to answer the question, but I'm also prefer to do it uninterrupted.
Go ahead.
And you can chip me if I interrupt Julie, which I haven't and I won't. But the notion that somehow saying to a patrol boat captain, tow this boat back, is going to have an impact on what we really need to do, which is to sit down, as Kevin has said from the first moment. The only way through this is a regional solution. The only way through this is getting not just Indonesia, but other neighbouring countries, including those involved in the Bali process, to agree that we've got to have agreements between receiving countries like Australia or destination countries like Australia and transit countries like Indonesia and come to a solution. We've got much more difficult problems facing this challenge now. For example, when it comes to resettlement, you've got a very small number of countries now who will take and resettle asylum seekers: Australia, Canada, the United States, the Nordic countries. So that is one of the problems that we have, a small number of countries willing to accept these obligations.
We are nearly out of time, so I'm going to jump in with one question for you before I hear from the other panellists, and that is, what is the current head of Navy saying to you about whether it can or can't be done?
Well, it's not what he says to me privately, it's what he says to me privately, which exactly replicates the evidence he gave at Senate estimates in November, December of 2011. Scott would have been there, where he says this is impracticable, it's dangerous, it won't work, all you're doing is putting people at risk.
Quick, please.
Senior defence personnel have said that our policies can work. And secondly, I have to point this out, Stephen, they are Indonesian boats with Indonesian crews.
So are you saying serving
of course,
defence personnel have said that to you?
No, this is Molan and Ritchie and Hogan in the last few days.
Former defence personnel.
Yes, have said, and they were Jim Molan.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find out if you're
Jim
talking
Molan, Brigadier Hogan has just returned from 3 years in Jakarta, and likewise with General Molan, and likewise with former Admiral Ritchie. These are people who were in the Defence Service at the time, and we cannot escape from the fact that they are Indonesian boats with Indonesian crews from Indonesian ports. Of course you can return them to Indonesia.
Okay, Scott Ludlam.
Just to remind us that these are human beings that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the people were clapping then, but Julie Bishop made a very powerful point, it
That they're
seems to
drowning,
me, that they're
absolutely.
drowning,
They are drowning
at
at sea now.
the way things are.
Yeah.
That's right. This is
And if you want to know
shameful.
why they're coming, go and see a film called No Fire Zone about what just happened in Sri Lanka, that the Australian government turned a blind eye to. And people will continue to leave there, no matter how cheap and nasty the debate gets in Australia, no matter how many racist billboards go up that Tony Abbott gets to stand in front of, people will keep coming.
We have to stop them
I'm sorry,
coming.
Julie, I want to hear from Mitch, Hooke and Narelda, and we're going to have to leave it after that.
Whoa, this is way outside my pay grade.
You know
But I gotta
Mitch,
tell you,
the interesting thing about this program is we ask for people's opinions.
Well, my opinion is that I think it's absolutely deplorable that we're seeing this trafficking in human misery. But I don't know what the solution is. But I am very concerned when I see it knocking across into, connected and conflated with an anti-foreign sentiment that's creeping in, whether it's 457 visas, and we want skilled migrant and skilled workers to fill the gaps that we have got ourselves. When you see it flowing over into anti-foreign direct investment, anti-foreign enterprise, I mean, it's time we kind of grew up a bit. But I think the fundamental problem...
So, just quickly on that, do you think that the political debate has become xenophobic?
That's a big call. But I am concerned. I'm not so much that the debates become xenophobic. I think everybody's just struggling with what is proving to be almost an insurmountable problem. I don't see anybody contesting the objectives here, and that is, I don't know anybody who's debating the fact that we're dealing with human lives. I don't know anybody who seriously contests that this trafficking and human misery has got to stop. But I don't know anybody who's really got the silver bullet solutions on how to do it, and we'll wait to see how that plays out. I was actually trying to go into some area where I did have a pay grade, which was how it's knocking across into an anti-foreign sentiment right across the country, which is quite deplorable.
Narelda.
Well, there's no doubt we need to save lives, and what we're seeing now from a media point of view is this phenomenon, a term asylum-seeker fatigue, where it seems something that we have to grapple with in the newsroom at Channel 10 here in Perth all the time, is that often in mainstream media only tragedies get reported, when people have lost their lives, but the fact is that boats are coming in all the time, and it's something, Are we overhearing about asylum-seeker boats arriving in Australia? Does it have to be, a tragedy to get us to talk about it? And does it take people dying to actually stop the boats coming?
That's where we'll have to leave it. It's all we have time for, I'm sorry to say, because the discussion was going passionately, as you saw. Please thank our panel, Mitch Hooke, Stephen Smith, Narelda Jacobs, Scott Ludlam and Julie Bishop. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, stop now. Stop. Our special thanks to the University of Western Australia's Octagon Theatre, and please give yourselves a quick round of applause for being such a great audience. Thank you. Next Monday, we'll be joined by the Minister for Employment, Education and Workplace Relations, Bill Shorten. John Howard's one-time Chief of Staff, Senator Arthur Sinodinos, who's now Parliamentary Secretary to Tony Abbott. Former Deputy Prime Minister and Ambassador to the Vatican, Tim Fischer. And the Chief Executive of Melbourne University Press, Louise Adler. Until then, good night.